Hello, you are listening to the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer, Amazon #1 best-selling author. You can find out more about me and my work at catherinecarrigan.com and unlimitedenergynow.com. While you're there, definitely sign up for my newsletter so you can learn even more about how you can heal yourself naturally. Our guest today is Ashley Davis Bush. Ashley Davis Bush is a psychotherapist and author. She is the author of 3 books, The Art and Power of Acceptance, The Little Book of Inner Peace, and Transcending Loss. You can find out more about Ashley Davis Bush and her wonderful work at her website, ashleydavisbush.com. Welcome, Ashley Davis Bush.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
So Ashley Davis Bush divides her time between Guatemala and New Hampshire in the United States. Now, Ashley Davis Bush, we know that grief is experienced individually, and yet it's also a universal experience. What are some common threads in the grief process?
Well, grieving is universal. We all are facing loss all the time from the moment we're born. And really, we don't even realize that loss is happening constantly every day as we age, as we change jobs, as we watch our children grow, as we move, as we get older and older, which we know about. So every day is a loss in some ways. But as a society, we don't like to look at that. And yet, again, it is one of the most universal experiences that we have. And the core of grief is that we have to feel pain. We have to let ourselves sink into the experience of loss. Grief is the natural and normal response to loss. And it's necessary for our mental health to actually allow ourselves to go into that process.
Thank you. Now, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, I believe, she talked about the different stages of grieving and loss. What are your thoughts on her stages of grieving?
Yes. Well, her work was seminal. It was amazing work. But really what happened are her 5 stages, which are anger. Well, she has first denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. But those were really for dying individuals. Her work was back in the 1980s. It was the precursor to the hospice movement. And she observed dying patients and observed those processes. She didn't actually mean them to be grieving steps. We've often taken that and transposed it to grieving. It was really the stages of dying. Now, that said, there are similarities because, of course, denial, which I call shock, is a big part of grieving. Anger and also depression is a big part of it, and even acceptance towards the end. But it implied there was an end, her work did, because again, it was for dying individuals and there was an end, which was the death. Grief is a little more complicated because it doesn't end in that way. And we can talk more about what that looks like. But so I guess in a nutshell, I would say her work was amazing and it launched a whole hospice movement and more awareness to death and dying. But the grieving process itself is a little bit different.
So here we are, we've just lived through 2 years of a pandemic. And of course, the coronavirus is still raging worldwide. But during this time, there's been a tremendous amount of change everywhere. And we've experienced the loss of the way we worked, the loss of companionship, the loss of how our children were educated, the loss of social activities. You can look at the losses we experienced really in every aspect of our life. What are your thoughts on the grieving that we have experienced as a result of the worldwide coronavirus pandemic?
Yes. Well, as you mentioned, there were so many losses embedded within this time period. And for some people, of course, it was even more extreme. They lost a loved one. And so we have there's loss of a loved one, and then there's loss of these other components, loss of freedom, like you say, this education of our children. And you have to allow yourself to deeply feel it. There's just really no other way around it. You have to feel the sorrow of it. And then the best thing, in my opinion, is that you start to, over time, look at positives, look at ways that you can turn it to something where you find the jewels embedded within it. And so that's always the balancing act of allowing yourself to feel sorrow, to grieve endings, to notice that every change has an end, but also to notice that every change has a beginning. And so there comes a point, and again, this takes time. This is not a quick fix. This is not a simple process, but that over time in the healing, you start to look at what good things can come out of this. What can I learn from this? How is this changing me, and how can it change me for the better?
Now, Ashley Davis Bush, in my work as a medical intuitive healer, one of the things that I look at, of course, is the body. And with every organ and every acupuncture meridian, there's emotions associated with that.
Mhm.
The large intestine organ and the large intestine acupuncture meridian, there's many emotions associated with that, but a big part of what that's about is letting go. And when we don't actually let go, we get stuck in depression, grief, guilt, and regret. And a wonderful affirmation for the large intestine meridian is, and this is interesting because there's two parts of it. I joyfully release all I no longer need in order to make space for beneficial change. So the two parts are joyfully releasing what isn't working anymore, what we don't need anymore, in order to make space for this beneficial change, even if at first we don't initially see what's coming, see what's better. A good analogy is if you want to, add new books to your library, maybe there's not enough space on your shelf until you get rid of the ones you've already read.
That's right. That's
Or
right.
your-
Or I'm thinking
closet.
of the cup, the empty cup. If your cup is too full, you can't keep adding. You have to empty the cup in order to make space.
Yeah, and if your closet is too full of clothes that don't fit you anymore or that you don't feel good in, then there's no space for the clothes that'll make you feel alive and beautiful or handsome. Now, Ashley Davis Bush, it seems we don't take time to grieve, but loss is everywhere. Why is the grieving process so important?
Well, it's important because it is, as we've said, this universal experience to loss. And if we don't give some attention to the letting go, maybe it's not joyful at first. And I like your affirmation, but I do know that with the people I work with, they would have trouble with the word joyful in the beginning. That might come later. So you have to look at the spectrum of grieving as a process. And you have to sort of honor each part of the process. But if you don't go through the process, what happens is you can get sick. It goes into the body. I'm sure as a medical intuitive, you know this, that it can transmit into all sorts of illness, or it can just get you stuck in your life. That if you kind of try to bury it and not give it attention, give it an honor and an acknowledgement, it's going to come back to bite you, so to speak. It's going to either create depression in your life, sort of a dull down feeling of your life. Because if you don't allow yourself to go down into the emotional repertoire, you don't come up either. In other words, if you stunt your pain, you'll stunt your joy. So I would say that in terms of your joyfully releasing, first you have to allow the pain to be there. Then you can get to the joy.
Okay, very good acknowledgements. Now, so I'm going to ask some general questions because there's so many things that we can lose. So for example, many people have a death of a loved one. And if you look at the Holmes and Ray stress scale that ranks stressors in our life, death of a spouse is at the top of the list. So death of a loved one, and it could be a spouse, but maybe it's a family member. Maybe it's a mother or father or brother or sister or a child. And I've worked with clients who've lost sons or daughters, and it's just absolutely devastating. Maybe it's a pet. So loss of a loved one, loss of a job. Okay, many people have lost way of living or their way of making a living. Also loss of a relationship, whether it's a divorce or even teenagers, on this homes. I think they need to have a different homes and race stress scale for teenagers, because your first love and then you have a breakup and it just feels absolutely devastating. Loss of a relationship. How long, and again, these are different events in our life, how long does it typically take to get over a major loss in our life?
Well, there's no simple answer to that. And, the truth is, while we can move forward, we don't really get over losses. They become part of us. They become part of the history of our lives, part of the compost, if you will. And so that's a mistake, I think, that people, especially grieving the loss of a loved one, they will ask that. When will this be over? When will I be my old self again? Well, the answer is you really won't be your old self again. You're changing, you're growing, you're birthing a new self. And that even the idea of waiting, when will this be over, is sort of the wrong paradigm. The paradigm really should be, how am I going to integrate this? How am I going to live with it? That I'm basically living with loss and love side by side in my life. So how am I going to manage that? And again, that's a process. But, we live in a society that we like closure, we like fixes, we like things to tie up with bows, we can be done with it. But loss is everywhere. And as you're suggesting, it's jobs, it's people, it's relationships, it's moves, leaving houses, it's everything. So the more we can sort of make friends with this idea of loss, the more we can embrace it and say, this is the deal. I get to come to planet Earth. I'm going to live a life. I'm going to be in this Earth suit. I'm going to learn lessons. But part of the deal is that I'm going to have to face losses again and again all the time throughout my life. And the more you can just sort of embrace that, as opposed to resist it, the better off your life will be.
I agree wholeheartedly with everything that you're saying. And there's definitely people that I've lost in my life that are just irreplaceable. And I still miss them to this day.
Yes, exactly. So that's not going to end. That's not going to go away. And so sometimes I'll say to people, your grief will end when your love ends. And of course, the point to that is that the love is not going to end, that you continue to miss them, you continue to think about them, and you continue to be enriched by having known them and loved them.
How has the process of healing from grief changed over the past 30 years?
Well, I have been in this field for over 30 years. And in fact, my first book is called Transcending Loss. That came out 25 years ago. My most recent book, Light After Loss, just came out this year in 2022. And so I found it interesting to bookend 25 years of my career with two grief books. What did I have to say that was different? And in some ways, the process has not changed at all, because basically the core elements are the same. You have to feel your sorrow. You have to express your sorrow. And I say sorrow, but it could be much more than that. It could also be regret and anger and despair and anxiety. So all the feelings that one might have going through a major loss. So you have to feel it, you have to express it in order to move it, share it, and find ways to be with it mindfully. So that process is the same. And that's what leads over time to what I call transcendence, which is really a choice. It's a choice to make something good happen out of the loss. And so again, that general arc of a journey is the same, but there is one major change in the last 30 years, which I have found really very interesting. And that is the rise of the internet and social media. And so what that means is that grievers can connect online in ways that they never could before. Back in the, in the dinosaur age, when I was first starting out in this field, we could have grief groups in person, and that's how people shared with each other, because there is a real magic that occurs when you're with a group of people that understand your experience. So for example, there's a group called the compassionate friends, and it's for bereaved parents. And so if you're in a room with men and women who are bereaved parents with other bereaved parents who get it, there's just a magical solace that occurs. So now you don't have to be in person to do that. And especially with the pandemic, that you can reach out to other grievers on Facebook, you can be in online groups, and it's just a way to really feel less alone. And that's part of the grieving process to heal, is to know that you're not the only one experiencing it. So that's been a really beautiful development over the last 30 years, is that grievers can connect.
Beautiful. And if I'm understanding your work correctly, from my understanding of what you just expressed, there's really 4 stages of dealing with grief: to feel it, express it, find ways to be with it, and then transcend it.
Yes, yes, that's exactly right.
That's beautiful. And with that, let's take a break to listen to a message from one of our commercial sponsors here at UK Health Radio, and we'll be right back with Ashley Davis Bush, psychotherapist and author. So Ashley Davis Bush, when we have friends and loved ones who go through a major loss, whether again it's a loss of a loved one, the loss of a job, or loss of a relationship, what's the best way for other people to support someone who's just had a major loss? What are we supposed to say or don't say, do or don't do?
Yeah, there's a lot of misconception around that. And so I'm glad we're discussing it. And mostly I would say that these apply to people for the loss of a loved one. And so some things that people might say are, your loved one is better off now, or is in a better place. And, they mean well, I'm sure, because people usually are not trying to insult you or hurt you. And maybe you even believe that's true. Maybe you really do believe they've gone on to another place. But saying it doesn't help the person in that moment, because what you're doing is invalidating their pain and trying to minimize it and trying to just talk them out of their grief. So the better response is simply to say, I am so sorry for your loss. Or even, I have no idea what to say, but I'm heartbroken for you, and I'm just here to be with you. Another thing people will say is, I know exactly how you feel. And that could apply to, a job loss, a divorce, any other kind of loss. Well, guess what? You don't actually know exactly how they feel, even if you had the exact same experience. So even if you too were divorced, you don't know how they feel because you weren't living their life. You're not living in their footsteps. So it's not particularly helpful to say that. More helpful is to say simply, tell me how you're feeling. I can only imagine. Or even, I can't imagine. If you can't, maybe it's the death of a child, you can't even imagine. Say, I can't imagine. Tell me how you're feeling. There's an expression that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth because we should listen twice as much as we should speak. So for someone who's grieving, you want to ask them open-ended questions and then be there to listen. Another one is when people, I'm sure very well-meaning, will say, call me if you need anything. That doesn't really work out. That's kind of a throwaway line. If this is someone you really care about, whom you want to help and support, show up with a dinner. Tell them, I'm going to babysit your kids on Friday night. Does that work for you? Tell them, I'm going to bring you, I don't even know what, a basket with candles and essential oils, and I'm going to send you a massage certificate. Just do it. Don't tell them, call me if you need anything, because they won't call. They'll feel awkward about it, and it puts the burden on them. So whenever you can show up with kindness, it's going to be well received. So the last thing I want to say about that is, I've heard many conversations from grievers who might be in a grocery store or in a drugstore, and they see a friend who sees them and then goes the other direction. In other words, avoids them. And the other way that might manifest is just a friend who never calls anymore, who sort of drops you. And grievers frequently feel dropped. And so the better alternative is if you see the person, just go right up to them and say, oh my gosh, I've been thinking about you and my heart, it just goes out to you. Tell me, how are things going? And then be prepared to listen. Be prepared to hear, oh, it's been a hard time. It's really, this is awful. Like, this is really hard. And just be there with them. You don't have to fix it. You can't fix it. You are offering a service by being there to listen. And that matters a lot.
Now, as a psychotherapist, I'm sure you're well aware of the fact that people don't like to feel pain. It's why 12% of Americans are on some form of antidepressant, and why so many people turn to other forms of addiction, whether it's be drugs or alcohol or food or over exercising or overworking. How can we actually feel pain? Because nobody, if you tell somebody you got to feel the pain, most of the time they don't want to do that. If you took someone to the gym and the trainer said, feel the burn, who wants to do that? Who wants to feel that intense and uncomfortable feeling? How can we feel pain without turning to addictive patterns?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. We do not like pain. We don't like it when we're in pain. We don't like it when our friends and loved ones are in pain, which is why we try to talk them out of it. And in a medical field, if you felt pain, you'd go get it checked out. If my, arm really hurt, maybe it's broken, we're going to go fix it. So there are a couple of ways to address that. I guess I would say, number one, you have to know that the pain has a purpose, that it is part of the healing journey. So it's not just pain for the sake of masochism. It has a purpose. But the second and third thing I'd like to say is that you need a lot of self-compassion, and you want to learn how to surf the pain, because the pain is not nonstop, number 10 all the time, day and night, day and night. It goes in waves. It comes and goes. So you want to be able to have a mindful relationship with your pain, where you're witnessing it, you're watching it. You can almost see as it's coming, as it's cresting, as it's, hitting the height of the wave and then receding. And mindfulness is a practice of being able to watch non-judgmentally your experience. So becoming really proficient at surfing your pain and knowing when it starts to crest and when it comes, you're going to find ways to comfort yourself that are not addiction. So you might want to get in bed with a teddy bear. You might want to call a friend. You might want to light a candle and listen to some music. You're going to find ways to comfort yourself as you're writing out the pain of grief. And in terms of self-compassion, there's a lot of beautiful research in self-compassion, the practice of it, from a researcher named Kristen Neff, N-E-F-F. And she has a beautiful website called selfcompassion.org. And it's all about the different ways to relate to yourself. It's a very intentional relating to yourself, where you use gestures such as a hand on your heart or a hand on your cheek, which stimulates oxytocin, which is the bonding feel-good hormone. And to be able to talk to yourself in a scripted way with loving kindness, so that you're feeling like you have your back, that you're with yourself, that you're not alone. So again, these are ways to learn to manage the pain. So it's not just like having a root canal day and night with no anesthesia, which would be dreadful and horrible. And of course, no one wants to do that. So it's, and working perhaps with a professional who can help you manage the pain so that you can get to the other side of it.
Now, earlier in this interview, you mentioned something that Sigmund Freud pointed out, and I'm going to totally butcher the quote, but Sigmund Freud basically said, buried emotions never die. They show up in uglier ways, such as physical illness, right? Big time, right? And in my work as a medical intuitive, one of the things that I look at sometimes is a person's will to live. So when you have a strong will to live, even if you have challenges in your life, you're going to do what it takes to overcome them, whether it's a hard life or a major illness or what have you. And sometimes it's my observation when we go through these major losses and of the people, opportunities, and lifestyle that we're accustomed to, that can absolutely affect our will to live. And we need to do the inner work in order to resolve that, so that we don't just literally give up and actually die. So
no, you're right. You're right. And you know about that, Catherine, is that I think it's important for people in a deep loss situation, a major loss, that it's not unusual, at least for a short period of time, to actually want to die, to actually feel like they're giving up the will to live. And it's interesting because it doesn't actually mean that they're suicidal or that they have a plan to kill themselves, but they are, at least for the moment, giving up. There's just a sense of, why should I go on? My loved one's not here. What's the point? So that's a natural part of the journey, believe it or not. And it doesn't mean they'll feel that way forever. So I try to help grievers especially feel, this is what you're feeling today. It makes sense that you're feeling this today, and just be with it. Just accept it, because emotions are always moving. They're moving. We want to keep them moving. They're fluid. We don't want them to freeze up. So letting someone know it's okay that you feel that you don't want to live anymore, but that's how you feel today. And you're not going to feel that tomorrow, basically, is the message. Kind of like when you're really sick with the flu, or if you had COVID, or you have some terrible sinus infection, it feels like you're never going to be well again, that this is how you're going to feel forever. And it's hard to even imagine that you won't always feel this way. But guess what? You won't, because you will be healing and things will be shifting. And I have so many people tell me things like, I feel now a year later in a way that I never could have imagined a year ago. So you just have to listen to someone, trust them when they say, you're feeling this for now, but it's not how you're always going to feel.
Now, one of my 10 books is called The Difference Between Pain and Suffering. And I have to bring this up because it's relevant to this topic, because I'll tell the story of how I came to write that book. Because one day I'm driving down the road and my guidance said, okay, you need to write an article about the difference between pain and suffering. So I write this little article in about 30 minutes. And then every day of my life, I would look, and people read that article over and over and over again. So I thought, people are really wanting to understand this. What is the difference? What's the difference between pain and suffering? So I wrote a whole book about how to get out of pain naturally. And that includes, so in a nutshell, pain is our physical experience. You stub your toe, your nose is congested, you have a pain of a heart attack. Suffering is the emotional experience. And I think it's my observation from my 29 years in natural healing that again, we're talking about grief here, and it's a process of suffering. So going back to your 4 stages of how to move through grief, and you mentioned some of them earlier, how can we develop the capacity to feel our suffering and not be overwhelmed by it?
Well, and I would even add to that, or even tweak it a little bit. The way I describe the difference between pain and suffering in Light After Loss is that pain is the emotional reaction to a loss. And so that, as we mentioned before, it's sorrow, it's despair, it's anxiety, it's anger, it's confusion, it's regret, perhaps. But when you resist it, that creates the suffering. So resistance looks like, this shouldn't have happened. Why did this happen? I wish this hadn't happened. Loss shouldn't happen. That you have some kind of resistance. In other words, it's the event plus the resistance that equals the suffering. When you don't add the layer of suffering, and the Buddha actually worked with this concept too. He called it the second dart. In other words, the first dart is what's happened. Your loved ones died. The second dart is when you add this sense of, it shouldn't have happened. Why did this happen? I wish this hadn't happened. This couldn't have happened. All of that layer that you add, that creates the suffering. It's the second dart. But the second you change that and you just accept it without any resistance and say, yes, this has happened. This is what happens. People die. People get sick. Tragedies happen. When there's no resistance, you feel just the pure pain and you don't have this extra level of suffering. Now, how do you manage the pain? Again, this goes back to the idea of self-compassion, learning to ride the waves, knowing that it's important and necessary as an important emotional, healthy process, and finding ways to comfort yourself, which is connecting with other grievers, making sure you learn how to say no and set boundaries, giving yourself the time you need to attend to this job. It basically becomes your job to grieve.
Now, the second stage in your process of dealing with grief is to express it. How can we express our grief in healthy ways?
Well, certainly talking with other people is a literal form of expression, to give it verbal airtime, to talk about what you're feeling, and to share memories. Sharing memories of your loved one is huge. So I would also say, in terms of expression, I'm a big believer in journaling and writing down what you're feeling, writing and expressing your process. Some people are artistic and they will write poems and they'll create artwork and they'll create sculptures and they give a visual image to their emotional inner experience. That is very healing. Having music where you move your body, whether it's dance or yoga, this is known to help heal trauma. And certainly I would say just not holding it within yourself. And some people will say, well, I'm not creative, although I would say everyone is creative, but maybe it's about taking a hammer and hitting a block of wood, or taking a pillow and, hitting the bed with it. That there needs to be some way to take emotional energy and move it, because that's what it is. We're trying to move emotional energy so that it can get on to the next stage.
Now, your third way of dealing with grief, the third step in your process, is to find ways to be with it. How can we find ways to be with our grief?
Well, it's a paradigm shift, really, to allow yourself to say, this is important. I have to be with it, to stop resisting it. You have to drop the resistance. One of my books is called The Art and Power of Acceptance. And it's a really, it's your key to inner peace, that the whole idea of acceptance, it's not about saying there cannot be change. It's about saying, I'm going to surrender to this moment and I'm going to see where it leads me, because it will lead you somewhere. So it's really a paradigm shifting of saying, maybe I don't even like my grief, but I'm going to try to be with it and see where it takes me. I'm going to attempt to make friends with it, to sort of inwardly bow to it and let it be your teacher. This isn't something that happens overnight or in one afternoon. This is an ongoing process. And talking with other grievers about how they're doing it is a big part of it. And reading books about grief, just allowing yourself to settle into the experience.
And with that, let's take another break and listen to a message from one of our commercial sponsors here at UK Health Radio. So Ashley Davis Bush, the fourth way that you find that people process their grief is to transcend it. How do you transcend grief?
Well, transcendence as a concept is this idea of rising above. And so lifting up, the word transcendence means to rise above. And if you think about being up in an airplane, when you rise above, you get a new perspective. You're seeing the earth from the airplane point of view in a new perspective. And transcending your grief means you're seeing a new perspective. And that usually has to do with growth. What comes next? What can I do with this pain? What can I make happen that hadn't happened before? Now, for some people, this is big stuff. They start organizations like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, MAD, was started by a bereaved mother who had lost her daughter to a drunk driving accident. So she started a whole organization to help work with that. And you hear stories like this of people who develop high profile, whether they become advocates or they, show up in Congress and testify against something that killed their loved one. So there's this idea of making it matter, that you're going to have it make a difference. You don't have to start an organization. So how does it look on a micro scale? Because that's sort of a macro scale. It could be that you donate books to a library in honor of your loved one, or you have some annual ritual that you devise, some kind of random act of kindness you do on their birthday or on an angelversary. Angelversary is the day that I call the day they left the planet, the exit date, when they became like an angel, instead of calling it the death day. It's basically an idea that what happened is going to make a difference. It's looking for the open door as opposed to just the closed door. And that's true even if it's not the death of a loved one. So for example, if you got fired from your job, you go through the same thing. You have to grieve, you have to express it, you have to be with it. And then you look, how can I transcend this? I'm going to find another job, a better job. You look for, where is the opening now? Where can you make something good happen out of something bad?
Which brings me to my next question, and we're going to move into the woo-woo realm here.
Okay.
And from my own personal experience and my work as a medical intuitive healer, what I find is that when people experience major losses, there's always an equal benefit, an equal blessing, a huge blessing. And part of the reason I believe that this is the case is that there is no such thing as a vacuum in the universe. So if you lose your mother, there is no one who will ever replace her. So that's not what I'm saying. But at the same time, if you look and wait and watch, you can actually find the blessings. And I think there's many reasons for that. One of the things that I know for a fact is that our loved ones, when they pass over and are no longer with us in the body, they are still there. Your mother's still there, your grandmother's still there. The people who love you are still very much in your life. I could tell stories about this, but what is your experience as a professional grief counselor? What are the major blessings that people experience in their grieving process?
Right. Well, I absolutely agree with you. And I think the biggest blessing of all is that love never dies, and that the relationship doesn't die. That even though the person is no longer on planet Earth, they are, as you say, they're very much with you. And that relationships are essentially physical, emotional, and spiritual. And when the physical goes, you still have the emotional and the spiritual, that those aspects of the relationship are very much still present. And so what I say to people is that you're going to continue to have a relationship with this person. You can talk to them, you can do automatic writing with them, which is this idea that you write to them with your dominant hand, but you can have them write you back, so to speak, through your non-dominant hand, say your left hand. And there's ways to communicate with them. There's signs that come from them. And of course, I'm sure you've heard a million sign stories from, pennies in the street and birds and butterflies and lights going on and off and white feathers and all sorts of ways that people send signs to their loved ones from the other side. So for me, part of the blessing is realizing that relationships continue. And not only that, that I've often thought of sort of the magical question is, I would say to a griever, if I could take away your pain and I could just erase it with a magic wand, you no longer feel all the feelings you're feeling. But the catch is that you never knew that person. You never met them. You never loved them. You didn't know them. They were never part of your life. Would you want that? And most people say no, they wouldn't want that because, of course, they were so enriched by knowing and loving that person. And so, yes, the pain now is because of that person in your life that is worth everything, because your life would have been so much emptier without it. And not only that, but the relationship continues. So the loss is less than you might imagine.
So I have to briefly share this story about my grandmother. So on the day that my grandmother died, I was in South Carolina, and I grew up in Savannah, Georgia. At the time, my grandmother was in a nursing home in Savannah, Georgia. And of course, if I had known that she was on death's door, I would have been right there holding her hand. Anyway, I happened to be in church in South Carolina, and it was just a beautiful day, nothing happening. And all of a sudden, this feeling of grief overcame me, and I started crying. And when I say I started crying, it wasn't just a tear. I was crying so much, there was quite literally water on the floor.
Oh my goodness.
Of the church. I mean, like just floods of tears. I had no idea what was going on. I was, of course, very embarrassed. And so I got in my car and drove straight back to Atlanta, which is where I live. And when I got home to Atlanta, I got the call that my grandmother had just died. So I picked up my journal and I started writing, and I heard her voice very distinctly. I'm going to get choked up even as I say this. And I'll never forget, she said, "I love you more than life itself."
Wow. Oh, how beautiful.
And
Yeah.
and I said to her, "Please don't leave me." And she said, "I won't. I'll be in your writing." And so at the time, I think I'd written one book at that time, and I'd also written 12 plays. So the very next day, we're all preparing to go back to Savannah to prepare for her funeral. And then I got a call from a theater in New York, and they had been going through play submissions and throwing things out. And they happened to pick up one of my plays in the process of literally throwing things away. And they started reading it and laughing hysterically. And they called and asked me if they could produce my play off Broadway. And I'll never forget turning to my husband at the time and saying, "My grandmother really works fast."
That's awesome.
And so I could tell story after story of absolutely sensing, seeing, and hearing, my loved ones around me. And I'm sure that other people can tell stories like that. So how can sensing, hearing, seeing our loved ones around us after they've passed over help us deal with the grief process?
Well, as you know, it's so comforting when you feel that connection. It's so affirming that life goes beyond this life. I think the hardest part is for people when they don't have that, when they want it. They hear other people getting signs, they hear other people having dreams, and they long for it. And so what I say to those people is just keep remaining open. Ask for signs, remain open for signs. And if your loved ones can get you a sign, they will. Maybe you're blocking it from fear or some other way, not to blame the person, but just to say, the more you can stay open to receiving, the more likely something will come through. And if nothing's coming through for you and you wished it would, just know that you have to stay open to the mystery, because you can see that other people have these kinds of communications, and just be open to the mystery that even if you're not receiving signs, it doesn't mean they're not trying or won't be able to in the future. Staying open to mystery is such a big part of this journey. It's the life and death movement. It's just so powerful. It's so mysterious. There's so much that we can't prove. We just have to take on faith or jump into the woo-woo world, as you say. But when you keep your mind open, you're more apt to receive signs.
How is healthy grief different from complicated grief?
Well, healthy grief is what we've been describing, this idea of feeling, expressing, being with, and choosing transcendence. Complicated grief is when you either shut down the process and you're sort of half alive, if you will, because you've just shut your emotional world down completely. And as we suggested, might have that come up as illness or depression or just basically a malaise about life. The other way complicated grief manifests is such intense experience of the grief that they can't move on, that a person can't move on. They just swamp themselves with the feelings. They ruminate. They basically give up on life. And they're so good at feeling their feelings, expressing their feelings, and being with their grief that they don't take the step to re-engage with life. And that's really what transcendence is. It's the decision, it's the choice to re-engage with life. And when people are stuck in the grief and they can't get past it, and by this I mean probably after year 2, because it's not uncommon, even for the first 2 years of grief after a major loss, to be feeling that kind of malaise, that kind of almost lost sense of being in the world. But after 2 years, if they're still really stuck in that, it means they're not engaged with life. And so to re-engage with life, you have to realize that you're still here for a reason. The reason you're still here. You need to engage with the people who are still alive. You need to engage with life. You need to choose again to choose life. Maybe you need to work with a professional to help you jump that hurdle, but basically there has to be a sense that I'm still here and I need to make that matter.
And I want to also say that sometimes when we lose a loved one or a family member, we haven't always resolved our issues with them.
That is true.
So, for example, recently I had a session with a client and her father had just died, I believe, in Holland. And she had a session with me so that she could communicate with him through spirit and ask him questions. Why did you physically assault me? Why did you sexually molest me? And so what do we do? And by her speaking to him through me as a medium, it helped her get some of the answers that I think that she'd been looking for her whole life. But how can we heal our grief when we haven't resolved our issues with a person before they die?
Right. That's complicated, isn't it? Well, one way is to talk to a medium such as yourself, where you can have that kind of connection. However, I believe anyone can do that. And part of it is through automatic writing, as I suggested, where you write to them in your right hand and have them answer you through your left hand. But also, I think through any kind of personal growth experience and or working with a therapist, that if you can start to see that you can make movement, even if they're gone, they don't have to be alive to do this. And in fact, often if you're looking for forgiveness, to forgive someone for hurting you, even if they're alive, you're not necessarily going to get an apology from them. So this is really about your work with your process and your experiences that have occurred in your life. And even if someone's alive, it doesn't mean that they're going to say, oh, I'm sorry, and you're going to have some big forgiveness amends. So the work is for you. So you can do the work. You need to do the work. Hurt people all the time. And so coming to understand that the person who hurt you was in fact an injured person themselves. And when you get to the place where you can say, how has this allowed me to grow? How has this happened for me and not just to me? How can I insist that I grow? Because chances are your soul chose everything that happened even before you were born. And so finding the gems of the lesson, it's your job, not their job.
Great insight. You've been listening to the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer, Amazon #1 bestselling author. You can find out more about me and my work at catherinecarrigan.com and unlimitedenergynow.com. While you're there, definitely sign up for my newsletter so you can learn even more about how you can heal yourself naturally. We've been listening to Ashley Davis Bush. Ashley Davis Bush is a psychotherapist and author, and you can find out more about her wonderful and important work at her website, ashleydavisbush.com. And remember that transcending grief is a healing process. And when you move through the stages of grief, as Ashley Davis Bush recommends, you can heal yourself naturally. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.